Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to let your sports opinions fly for the main event. A 7-team elimination match to decide the District 4 3A Championship. Presented to you live by PilotPointBearcats.com. This 10-week match has been sanctioned by the University of Interscholastic League. Our celebrity referee for the District 4 3A show is none other than the daytime psychology professor, Texas high school football storyteller, North Texas insider, and DFW Inside High School Sports, the most feared member of the Texas high school mafia, the one, the only, small-town Digsy, the professor,
It is week 7 of the high school football season and business is picking up. I am Matt Diggs here with the District 4 3A report brought to you by PilotPointBearcats.com. All things Pilot Point, you can check that out. You can check out their Twitter page at @PPBearcatBlog. If you play Pilot Point, you want to see some great pictures, some great video. They have all things. It's one of the better social media sites I've seen in all of high school football, and I'm not saying that just because they sponsor the podcast. It's really good stuff. In fact, it was about 10:30 last week, and I couldn't find the Paradise and Pilot Point score, and I go to that website, and all of a sudden I'm watching the live video stream on YouTube, and that game is way closer than I'm expecting, and we'll talk more about that later on. But our lead story this week is a little bit of District 4 3A calibration that has nothing to do with District 4 3A, and you might be asking yourself, well, tell me, Professor Diggs, how does anything having to do with District 4 3A, not have anything to do with District 4 3A? Well, this week, Gunter plays Bells, and that's probably one of the 3A Division II games of the week. And again, you might be sitting there wondering, well, yeah, that's great that Gunter plays Bells, but we won't be seeing them in the playoffs. What does this have to do with District 4 3A? And I'll tell you a little bit of a story, a little bit of an anecdote. There's a team in 6A. You may have heard of them. They're called Waxahachie. And Waxahachie was 4-0 going into when they played DeSoto a couple of weeks ago. And we just did not know anything about Waxahachie. You know, Waxahachie had a couple of nice wins, and the wins that they had, they looked really good at. But they hadn't played any of those next-level teams. And so we didn't have much of a gauge on them. And they played DeSoto a couple of weeks ago, and DeSoto beat the living tar out of them. And Waxahachie was a team that, wanted to be state ranked. They wanted to be one of the top teams in the area. They had beaten a lot of teams below them convincingly, and they were clearly better. They were clearly a team that is improving and getting better. But when they played a big dog, when they played a team that would indicate how well they would play in the playoffs and indicated how far they might be able to go, they got beat. Again, I can see our friends at the District 4 3A report listening. What does this have to do with District 4 3A? Well, for me, Whitesboro is very much like that team. Whitesboro is a very nice team, and they're having a heck of a year. But we just don't know a lot about Whitesboro. They're 5-0. They have 2 nice wins over Bells and Pottsboro. They have 3 really nice blowout wins. But you just wonder, how good is Whitesboro? And we just don't know a lot about them. And then you look at Brock, and you look at Brock as 2-4, but they're 2-0, and they're starting to get some momentum in district. And you're like, okay, well, we know Brock is good. Brock is Brock. They're, one of the top teams in the area. But Whitesboro fans, and rightfully so, have got to be feeling their oats. They're 5-0, and Brock is 2-4. How good is Whitesboro? Should Whitesboro be state ranked? Should Whitesboro be one of the top teams in the area? And there's just so much we don't know because their two best wins are over teams that you're not going to see till the state semifinals. You got Pottsboro, a Division two or a 3A Division One team, but they're in Region Two, and then their second best win is over Bells, and Pottsboro doesn't have any real calibration, and neither does Bells. So Whitesboro is in this spot where they look very good. They have a very good resume, but we don't know what any of it really means. Same thing with Brock. We know that Brock has a lot of good losses, and some of their losses are better than others. And we do know their two wins over the last couple of weeks are very impressive over Boyd and Peaster. But there's still a lot about Brock we don't know because they're playing up these teams that they're not expected to beat. And then, then they're beating these teams very convincingly that they are expected to beat. So we don't have that middle ground on Brock, and we don't have that middle ground on Whitesboro. And I think we're going to get a little bit of the puzzle this week when Gunter plays Bells. And the reason why I think we're going to get that piece of the puzzle, because I was at the Gunter Brock game, and Brock probably was a little better than Gunter, if we're being honest, especially in the second half. Brock figured it out. They were able to do whatever they wanted to. We got the special teams return and the pick six, and if you take those out of the equation, then Brock is probably a little bit better than Gunter. If you played that game 10 times, Gunter might win 5 or 6 of them. Brock might win 5 or 6 of them. They are very competitive. You just don't know how that would go. And then you have Bells versus Whitesboro. And Whitesboro has beaten Bells the last couple of years in very competitive, very good games. And Bells is, I think they're number 4 in Dave Campbell's 3A Division 2 ranking. So we know Bells in their division are very good, but we don't know how good Bells is compared to Gunter, because it's great to be a highly state ranked team, but if you are so far below the number 1 team, it doesn't really matter. Then if your aspiration is state championship, you're going to be very disappointed. If your aspiration is getting better, maybe getting to the regional finals, building a program, and I think for Whitesboro, that's part of their goal. It's a bigger picture of reimagining what it is to be a Whitesboro Bearcat, and reimagining the expectations, and reimagining the high ceiling that they're going to have, and Bells is kind of like that as well. So when we have Bells versus Whitesboro, if you look at that, Whitesboro needed a onside kick to hold on, because Bells they were beating Bells when they got the onside kick. I know there was some confusion in that in the District 4 3A report a couple of weeks ago when I had said something to that end, and well, we didn't need that onside kick. Well, you didn't need the onside kick, but it kept Bells from having the opportunity to have a late drive, throw a Hail Mary, whatever the case may be. Whitesboro put the foot on the throat, ended the game, and I credit that smart onside kick for the ability to do that. Again, we don't know what would have happened if Bells got the ball back because Whitesboro never gave them a chance. But if you played that game 10 times, I think Whitesboro is going to win most of them, probably 9 or 10 of those games. But they're always going to be that competitive. I mean, it's always going to be one-score games, and it's going to be a play here, a play there. But Whitesboro, with their superior depth, I think would beat Bells more often than not. So again, you might be asking, what does this have to do with the District 4 3A report? Well, we have Gunter and Bells playing each other this week. And if you look at what it is, you've got Gunter and Brock, about the same team, one score either way, however you want to word it. And then you've got Bells and Whitesboro, one score either way. Whitesboro probably a little bit better than Bells more often than not. And now you've got Gunter and Bells playing each other. So if you're a Whitesboro fan and you're thinking to yourself, I think that we can beat Brock this year, then what you are cheering for, in my opinion, is a competitive game with Bells and Gunter, because if Bells is right around where Gunter is, maybe 1 or 2 scores, then you are probably 1 or 2 scores away from Brock. I think these are great metaphors because we see Gunter and Brock and we see Whitesboro and Bells, and they're very similar kinds of teams. But if, as in the past, Gunter just beats the living heck out of Bells, then I think you have to look to yourself and go, well, I guess Brock is that good, and Bells is not as great. That maybe they shouldn't be a number 4 team in 3A, and I think maybe that speaks to the difference. So when we are looking at this game, I think it's going to tell us a lot about Whitesboro, and it's going to tell us a lot about Brock. And if you look at last year, Gunter and Bells played 41 to 14 in that game. So I mean that's about where they're at. And then if you look at the score last year, Whitesboro beat Bells 41-34 in overtime. So Gunter was about 4 scores better than Bells, and if we don't have any Gunter and Brock games last year, but then if you go look back at Whitesboro last year and how they played Brock, it was a 3-score game in the regular season, and then it was a 5-score game in the playoffs. And I get it kind of gets away from you at times, but on average that would be about a 4-score game, as the calibration goes on that. So if Bells is a better team this year, and Whitesboro is a better team, and I think Whitesboro is a better team, then I think Bells will play Gunter a lot more competitively. But again, if we're seeing Gunter beat, Bells by 27, 35, somewhere in that range, I think it tells us that Brock is about where they're at. Now, and I've mentioned this on Twitter and a couple of other places. I still don't think we've seen Whitesboro's best game, and I don't know why we haven't seen Whitesboro's best game. There's just something like it's a mistake or two. It's a second half where there's a little bit of a question. Whitesboro has a much higher ceiling, I think, than Bells has, and that's a metaphor I use in the high school football world to talk about potential. And I definitely weigh that when I weigh my rankings. And I think Whitesboro has a lot more potential than Bells has. That's why I think if Whitesboro and Bells play over 10 times, Whitesboro is going to find a way to win 9 or 10 of those because they have so many athletes and maybe not all of them are being used. And Bells is kind of what they are. They do what they do very well, and they're going to be consistent in that. But they're not, all of a sudden going to have a kickoff return for 90 yards or something to that end out of nowhere because Bells is who Bells is. But Whitesboro has a lot more weapons and a lot more variability on to that end. So it's a big game. It's why it's our lead story, Gunter versus Bells. Keep an eye on that on Friday night, and I think that will give you a little bit of insight into Brock versus Whitesboro. If that game is if Bells wins, then I would think that all of a sudden Whitesboro would probably get a state ranking bump, especially if they're able to win their game this week. And then all of a sudden, okay, Whitesboro has a much more meaningful win over Bells. If the game is even close, let's say 1 to 2 scores, Gunter wins 28-14 or 42-28, then to me, if you kind of look at the fact that Gunter won and Whitesboro won, I would say that Brock and Whitesboro might be a 1-score or 2-score kind of a game. And we know that Brock has a tendency this year to make 1 or 2 crucial mistakes almost every single game. And if you even look at the Peaster game, you're going to see 2 turnovers. They've yet to play a fully clean game against a competitive team. Now, if Whitesboro can figure out a coaching play, a special teams play, there are so many times if you look at the power polls and whatnot that a team that I would say should beat a team by 2 scores doesn't because of 1 or 2 mistakes. Plano East versus Hebron last week. It was a game where Plano East had 3 massive mistakes in that game and lost the game by 2 scores. They didn't have those 3 massive mistakes. They probably win the game by a touchdown. Same thing theoretically with Brock and Whitesboro. If Whitesboro plays a clean game and there's only about a 2-score difference between them, and then they get 2 or 3 special plays that go their way, you're going to see Whitesboro beat Brock in that hypothetical situation. But we just don't know enough about those teams. Obviously, they're going to play next week, so we will get our answer on the field, and Brock will have 2 weeks to get ready for that. But if you want a little bit of an appetizer and to see how you think that game is going to go, Gunter versus Bells, I think the point margin of that game will be within 1 or 2 scores of what the real thing is. with Brock and Whitesboro. If Gunter wins this game going away, I think, pick Brock by 28 next week. If it's a very close game, one or two scores, and Gunter just gets by bells, I think you can start to sound the upset alert when it comes to that. So that is our lead story, and hopefully you see why I think that game matters. But a game that mattered last week that was a little bit surprising was the Pilot Point versus Paradise game, and Pilot Point made a very good showing of itself. They did lose that game 48-34, but that game was a game where Pilot Point was winning the game in the fourth quarter. And Paradise scored the last 2 points. That game was 34-33 in the fourth quarter, and like I said, Paradise scored the last 2 touchdowns to pull away. But to me, Paradise was supposed to win this game pretty convincingly. And if you look at the Whitesboro versus Pilot Point game, it was not a game that Whitesboro really had much of a problem in. Now, if you're a Pilot Point fan, you might look to the fact that, well, in the second half we actually played them pretty well. We just got down in the first half too much, and we were unable to overcome it. But in the second half, we showed a little bit more of what you would expect. And then if you're a Whitesboro fan, you might rationalize that we got up early, we got complacent, and just kind of game management and ran out the string. So, what is the real version of Pilot Point? I think Pilot Point had a very good accounting of themselves in this game. And the thing I'm seeing with Pilot Point that when I'm looking a little bit deeper into the box score is they are trusting Wyatt Smith, their senior quarterback, to do much more than they did maybe in preseason or last year. He went 20 for 36 for 290 yards and 3 touchdowns. He also ran the ball 15 times for 49 yards and 2 touchdowns. So accounting for 5 touchdowns against a Paradise defense that we thought was pretty good shows us that Wyatt Smith is moving his game to that next level and is meeting the challenge of District 4-3A as we continue. Aston Kirby had 10 receptions for 188 yards in all 3 of those receiving touchdowns. Gage Anderson, the sophomore that we talk about and check in on Pilot's Point, had 11 carries for 30 yards in that game. So they're really putting a lot more weight and a lot more of the pressure of the Pilot Point season and success on Wyatt Smith. And I would say in the second half of the Whitesboro game and in this game against Paradise, even though you will see 0-2 in the record book, that Wyatt Smith has elevated his game to that next level to where I would say, as of right now, Pilot Point would be probably the 4 seed the way they're playing if they can continue that on. And we'll have some fascinating thoughts of how that works against Ponder this week. But I'll just go ahead and tell you, I think Pilot Point's going to beat Ponder the way the matchups go, especially given how Wyatt Smith has played and how bad Ponder's defense is. If Pilot Point can put up these numbers against Paradise's defense, they're going to put up some huge numbers against Ponder's defense. And if Ponder can keep up the track meet, I think Pilot Point will be able to, we'll have some video game numbers that we're going to be talking about next week. But I'm really liking what Pilot Point is doing. But when you go back in that game, it was a back and forth game nonstop. Paradise scored first. Austin Iglesias with a 32-yard run. And then Pilot Point answered back, take the lead 7-6. Iglesias with another 1-yard run. And then Kirby again also answered back to go up 14-13. Paradise with a Leo Hernandez run gets another touchdown. Now it's 19-14. Then Pilot Point again answers back, and it's 21-14. Paradise scores 2 straight. But then Pilot Point scores 2 straight, and that's how we got the fourth quarter. It's up 34-33, but Paradise scored the last 2 touchdowns. So really the last 6 possessions, you had 2 Paradise, 2 Pilot Point, 2 Paradise touchdowns, and that was the accounting of the game. And Paradise with 29 second half points to barely pull it out, 48-34. And they had good numbers. I mean, Austin Iglesias did everything you would expect. He ran the ball 23 times for 141 yards. It was only 9 of 15 for 196 yards passing. Aiden Winters for Paradise was the big receiver, 3 receptions for 110 yards. But what Pilot Point did was they said, okay, we're going to try to limit Austin Iglesias from beating us. Somebody else has to beat us. And nobody else was able to step up. and Pilot Point was able to play with them. You take their defensive scheme, and then what Wyatt Smith did, it worked. And I'm sure Pilot Point is probably looking at that. The fourth quarter, they didn't play a complete 48 minutes, and if they could have stepped up to the challenge of the fourth quarter, they likely would have won that game. What that tells me, because Paradise is a very good team this year, is that I think Pilot Point may be a little bit better than we think, and they're getting better at the right time. And I think we're going to see that this week when they play Ponder. So good on Pilot Point. It's always good to see Pilot Point get better throughout the year. Because last year, one of my disappointments with Pilot Point was I didn't think they got better as the year went on. I think they kind of peaked early, and then as the season went on, you didn't see any adjustments. You didn't see them getting better. This Pilot Point team, especially the last 2 weeks, or really the week and a half, is getting better each week. And even going back to that second half of the Farmersville game, you could start to see that improvement kicking in. I think Wyatt Smith is starting to get his confidence, starting to get his sea legs, Lieutenant Dan, if you will. Moving to the next game, Brock versus Peaster. This game was a little bit closer than I thought as well. And it's hard. I had a question on Twitter about, we got Whitesboro against Peaster, and can you really evaluate Brock versus Peaster and Whitesboro versus Peaster? And really the answer for me is no to that end, because it's all about blowout management. Brock was winning this game 28-0 at half. And pretty much, I think everybody, if you see Brock is winning 28-0 at half, it's really not a game in doubt. And different coaches, for different reasons, whether it was suspensions or homecoming or bye week, or you just want to see some younger kids play before the bye week, maybe their coach has an evaluation tool he likes to do in the bye week. You can't manage blowouts. You can't manage blowouts, but you can't evaluate blowouts. Okay, well, Brock won by 35 and Whitesboro won by 33. Which of those is better? I mean, you can't do that. But what you can do is, if Pilot Point plays Paradise pretty close, and Whitesboro plays Pilot Point and blows them out, you can evaluate those two elements. But this week's Peaster versus Whitesboro game, I'm not looking at blowout management as far as evaluating that. I'm looking more at that Gunter versus Bells game as far as that goes. But Brock, again, with another good week. And again, they're getting more confidence, and they're doing it on the ground. I think that's where their base offense wants to be, with Tyler Moody being more efficient in his throwing. And one thing I saw in the Gunter game is that if you press Tyler Moody to do too much, it's not to say he can't answer that challenge, but he does better when he's asked to manage as opposed to have to make a play. And maybe to win a state championship, he has to learn to make those plays. But I think he plays better within the system when he's got the running game around him doing well, and then he can kind of distribute the ball and take meaningful big shots when the plays are there and it's one-on-one, and he's not having to throw a perfect ball into triple coverage to try to make a play. That's the Tyler Moody that I think he's not suited to be that kind of a player. And who is suited to be that kind of a player? Nobody wants to be able to push it down and throw it into triple coverage and things like that. So I think this version of Tyler Moody is Brock's best version of Tyler Moody, which means you might not get the video game numbers, but you look at him as the leader of the team, as the distributor of the team, and as the game manager of the team. Brett Tutter, 11 carries for 132 yards and 2 touchdowns. Reed Watkins, 9 for 70 and 3 touchdowns. And again, when he has to run the ball, 8 for 41 and a touchdown for Tyler Moody. 11 of 18 throwing the ball for 114 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. Jet Jones, the big receiver of the day, 5 for 41. Reed Watkins, 2 for 22. Jackson Hart, 1 for 16. Our guy Carson Finney, 2 for 5. And Cannon Stevens, 1 for 30. Big day for the defense as well, keeping them down. They didn't really have a lot of sacks, but Zach Brewster again with a big day, and then Cooper Massey as well. Good defensive performances, and Luke Surley as well with 6.5 tackles for Brock. And the reason I can give you defensive stats is because they put them out there on the internet. So good on you, Brock, for doing that. Final game of the week last week was Whitesboro versus Boyd, and this was a game that I think again, if you're looking at blowouts, we had Boyd versus Brock last week, and now we have Boyd versus Whitesboro, and now we're going to have Whitesboro versus Peaster after we had Brock versus Peaster. I don't think you can really read into this as, oh well, clearly Brock is better because they beat Boyd by more than Whitesboro did. You can't. You kind of can look at the first half. It was a pretty competitive game. Almost through halftime, it was 22-8 at half, and then Whitesboro went 21-0 in the in the second half, which to me shows the improvement I'm looking for at Whitesboro. Because if you look at what they did against Pilot Point, they played around in the second half, and Whitesboro pretty much shut Boyd down in the second half, and that's the kind of thing we're looking for Whitesboro. At least I'm looking for in my analysis and progression. And also defensively, and I kind of talked about their defense maybe not being the strength of their team last week. What did they do? They completely shut down Gavin Rosado for only 10 carries for 30 yards. Boyd had almost 200, only 200 yards, less than 200 yards of offense. Braden McIntyre went 14 for 30 with 145 yards. They were able to get 2 interceptions. This is the Whitesboro that is a dangerous Whitesboro team. You might start doing score comparisons. Now they have 2 straight 5-score wins over teams that they should be beating. So it'll be fascinating for me to see that Gunter versus Bell score. Maybe Bell's got a little more than we think that they will. Maybe Gunter isn't that kind of a team because Whitesboro is starting to put together quite a bit of a run, and it'll be fascinating for next week, the big Brock versus Whitesboro game. Mac Harper, another efficient night, and he is a player. We talked about Tyler Moody, who may not always be able to, make the tough plays and to downfield coverage, or may not even be comfortable. I'm sure he can. If you're a high school quarterback, you're obviously capable of making those plays. Mac Harper is a player who can make big plays and a lot of chunk yardage, and he works best when he has a person like Grayson Ledbetter who's able to run 26 times for 247 yards. So then when you have an RPO play action and you got one-on-one coverage, Mac Harper can take advantage of that. Obviously, if Whitesboro is losing to Brock and you're having to press, Mac Harper can make mistakes. Any quarterback can make mistakes when you're having that kind of pressure put on you and you're having to force plays because you get down early, and that's obviously a situation you don't want to be in. But the element that we're going to have in this game, this Brock versus Whitesboro round of potentially 2 games that we didn't have last time, is Grayson Ledbetter. Can he free up Mac Harper to be the best version of Mac Harper, just like we talked about with Brock and Tyler Moody? Can the Brett Tutters of the world free Tyler Moody up to be the best version of Tyler Moody that he can be? And then if either of the 2 running games can't, which of the 2 quarterbacks can make the big plays down the field? We will find out as the world turns, if you will. On the receiving side of the ball, Mac Harper also had 2 rushing touchdowns. Not a pretty stat line running the ball, 9 for -7 yards, probably some sacks involved in that, but he did get the ball in for 2 touchdowns. Receiving, it was the cousin-to-cousin connection. Clay Hermes, 2 receptions for 58 yards, but if he's going to catch the ball, it's going to be in the end zone for the touchdown. Carter Sluter had some big chunk plays down the field, 2 receptions for 87 yards. And then Jay Sanders, a lot of those flats and dig routes, 6 for 63. If you need 10, 15 yards, you go to Jay Sanders, and he delivered in that shorter passing game. And then you had the big chunk yards with Clay and Carter down the field. Doesn't have to be a lot when you're averaging 29 and 43.5 per reception down the field. So Whitesboro with a big win, a convincing win over Boyd this past week. Which brings us to our games of the week this week. And I think the most important game of the week is that Ponder versus Pilot Point game. And when I look at what Wyatt Smith has done over the last couple of weeks, and I look at Ponder's inability to stop anybody and have Paradise's defense, have pretty much slowed them down. I don't know if Pilot Point's defense is better than Ponder's defense, so I think Ponder is going to get some scores, but I cannot see this version of Wyatt Smith, who just looks like he is in the zone, having a problem scoring on Ponder's defense, a team that's giving up 50 points a game. I think Pilot Point's going to beat Ponder this week. I think they're going to win maybe a 56-35 kind of a game. I think they're going to win this game pretty convincingly. The only way, to me, I start to look at turnovers and things to that end. If Pilot Point has 3-4 interceptions, if they play out of their pace, then okay, you might see that kind of result. But Ponder, to me, hasn't shown they have the defense to force turnovers or to even really capitalize on turnovers. Ponder's going to play a very upscale pace of football, and they've had a couple of weeks to prepare for this. So we'll see if that bye week sets them up very well for Pilot Point. Paradise versus Boyd, I think Paradise is going to bounce back against Boyd and beat them similarly. And if you look at how these schedules have gone, poor Peaster and Boyd are both starting out with the big three. Boyd has already had Whitesboro and Brock, and now they get Paradise, and we know Peaster is going through it as well. They had Brock last week, and then Whitesboro this week, and then they have Paradise before things settle down a little bit for Paradise. So weird how the schedule works out like that, where you have these teams that they're just kind of bouncing from one side to the other, but it does allow us to have a little bit more calibration in our results. And then Whitesboro against Peaster, I similarly think Whitesboro will have its way with Peaster. Probably a very similar score to what Brock did. Can't really, Peaster is having the psychological issues of having lost 4 of their first 5, and then last year Peaster just got completely embarrassed by Whitesboro as part of that 3-game series at the end of the year where Peaster just couldn't slow down anybody. I think I saw enough fight in Peaster this past week to where I think that, they got a little bit of something, and I'm a little more, I think Peaster and Pilot Point is still for your 4th playoff spot, the way things are kind of calibrating and the matchups are starting to shake out. But I think Whitesboro will have their way. I think they will probably win by less than Brock did. I will hang on to that because I think Brock is a better team than Whitesboro as of right now. I could have my mind change with that 3A Division II game of the week, but as of right now, I do think Brock is a couple scores better than Whitesboro. So I think Whitesboro might win by 21-28, maybe a late garbage score either way to make the margin look a little less, a little more flattering, I should say, than otherwise given. So that is the District 4 3A report for the week. I am the Professor Matt Diggs. Again, thank you to the PilotPointBearcats.com for another great sponsoring. Go ahead and start to get that outro rolling, and we'll ask Ric Flair the philosophical question. Sir, am I leaving?
I ain't leaving! Woo! 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 Woo!